Dropping into the war zone, a tiny human frigate faced a blockade of 300 alien dreadnoughts, prompting the Valen Queen to laugh at what she called a pathetic suicide mission. She had no idea that a single, battered rust bucket was about to completely rewrite the laws of naval warfare. The colony world of Aegis 7 had been burning for 19 days. From the reinforced bunker of the planetary capital, Governor Thomas Wright watched the telemetry screens with sunken, bloodshot eyes. The orbital defense grid, a state-of-the-art network of railgun platforms built by the Lockheed Martin Orbital Division back on Earth, had been reduced to floating slag within the first 48 hours. Now the sky was dominated by the Valen armada. 300 biometallic dreadnoughts hung in low orbit, casting long, jagged shadows across the continents. They didn't bomb the cities into oblivion. The Valen were too cruel for that. They wanted the planet intact, and they wanted the humans to suffocate. They had blockaded the hyperspace lanes, cutting off all supply routes. Food synthesis plants were failing. The atmosphere scrubbers in the domed settlements were breaking down. Millions were suffocating, starving, and waiting for an end that seemed inevitable. In orbit, aboard her flagship, the Obsidian Crown, Sovereign Xylocher watched the planet with speckled compound eyes. The Valen were a proud, ancient species, possessing technology that made humanity's combustion and crude nuclear fission look like child's play. Xylocher had crushed a dozen species in her long reign. Humanity, she had decided, was merely a stubborn weed that needed to be uprooted. She opened a system-wide broadcast, her voice a telepathic hiss that translated into jarring, metallic English through the colony's comm systems. People of Earth, your government has abandoned you. Your United Nations Space Command has retreated beyond the Orion Arm. You have no fleet. You have no hope. Surrender your atmospheric processes and submit to the harvest, or die slowly in the dark. Far beyond the system's edge, 12 light-years away in the deep, uncharted void, the distress signal finally reached its only listener. The UNS Manticore was not a battleship. It wasn't a destroyer, or even a heavy cruiser. It was a stalwart-class reconnaissance frigate, built 14 years ago at the Boeing Northrop shipyards on Mars. It was small, heavily armored for its size, but armed only with a pair of defensive point defense cannons and a single, outdated spinal railgun. Its primary mission was deep space charting and anomaly detection. Captain George Knox sat in the center seat, reading the desperate telemetry data flowing in from Aegis 7. He was a veteran of the first Centauri skirmishes, a man in his late 50s with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen too many good people die in the black. Captain, Lieutenant Commander Jessica Rhodes, his executive officer, said softly from the tactical station. The transmission is on a continuous loop. Aegis 7 is completely surrounded. System scans indicate over 300 capital-class Valen signatures. And, she swallowed hard, Command at Earth has ordered a total withdrawal from the sector. They aren't sending a fleet. They consider the colony lost. Knox leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests. He looked around his bridge. His crew was young. Chief Engineer David Higgins was only 26, barely out of the academy. Helmsman Michael Brooks was sweating, staring at his console as if hoping the data would change. Command is cutting their losses, Knox said, his voice a low, steady gravel. They don't want to risk the home fleet against a force that size. Tactically, it's the correct move. So we just let 3 million people die, sir? Higgins asked, his voice cracking over the comms from engineering. Knox was quiet for a long moment. He brought up the structural schematics of the Manticore. He looked at their payload. They didn't have nuclear torpedoes. They didn't have plasma lances. But they did have something else. 6 months ago, the Manticore had been retrofitted with an experimental piece of technology designed by DARPA's Advanced Propulsion Lab, the Alcubierre shear drive. It wasn't a weapon. It was meant to create micro-wormholes for instantaneous data transmission across galactic distances. It required astronomical amounts of energy, generated by an unstable, heavily modified General Dynamics fusion core. "Mr. Higgins," Knox said slowly, "if we overload the magnetic confinement field on the shear drive and drop out of hyperspace in the middle of a dense gravitational well, what happens?" A heavy silence fell over the bridge. Over the comms, Higgins could be heard typing frantically. "Sir, the math on that is completely theoretical. Dr. Albert Graves at MIT wrote a paper on it, but it was classified as a Class A hazard. If we dump the drive's field while inside a gravity well, it creates a spatial compression wave, a gravity tsunami. It would warp local space-time so violently that it would tear apart anything caught in the ripple. Could it tear apart biometallic dreadnoughts? It would snap them like dry twigs, Captain. But the sheer kinetic blowback would likely vaporize us, and we'd have to drop out of slip space dangerously close to the enemy fleet to ensure they get caught in the radius before they can raise spatial anchors." Knox stood up, straightening his uniform jacket. "Plot a course for Aegis 7, maximum slip space velocity." Rhodes stared at him. "George, it's 300 ships. Even if we trigger the wave, we have to survive long enough to reach the center of their formation. They'll blow us to dust the second we exit slip space." "We're a small ship, Jessica," Knox replied, a grim smile playing on his lips. "And the Valen are incredibly arrogant. We'll use that against them. Brooks, spin up the FTL drive." The helmsman nodded, his hands flying across the terminal. "Spooling up now, sir. Transition in 3, 2, 1. The Manticore stretched into a sliver of blinding light and vanished into the void, a solitary bullet fired into the heart of a Leviathan. Space tore open above Aegis 7. It wasn't a graceful exit. The Manticore ruptured the fabric of normal space, spewing a massive cloud of Cherenkov radiation as it slammed on the brakes. The tiny angular frigate drifted into the orbital theater, completely dwarfed by the massive, sleek, insectoid hulls of the Valen blockade. Against the backdrop of the massive alien armada, the human ship looked like a piece of space debris. Aboard the Obsidian Crown, warning klaxons shrieked. Sovereign Xylocha spun toward the primary viewing sphere. Her tactical officers, massive, chitinous warriors, clacked their mandibles in confusion. "Report," Xylocha commanded. "A spatial rupture, Sovereign. An unauthorized entry into our blockade sphere." The tactical officer paused, its antennae twitching. "It is a single vessel. Human origin. Mass profile is negligible. No capital-class weaponry detected. Shielding is archaic." Xylocha narrowed her eyes. She zoomed the optical sensors on the tiny ship. She could see the faded gray paint, the burns from micrometeorite impacts, the blocky, ungraceful angles of human engineering. The words UNS Manticore were painted on the side in bold white lettering. A cruel, resonant laugh bubbled up from Xylocha's throat. "This is their desperate rescue. A solitary, rotting scout ship? The humans are not just weak, they are utterly insane." "Shall we vaporize it, Sovereign?" "No," Xylocha sneered. "Open a channel, visual and audio. Let the planet below watch the death of their final hope. On the bridge of the Manticore, the main screen flickered to life. The hideous, multi-eyed visage of the Valen Queen filled the screen. "Human vessel," the Queen's voice hissed through the speakers, dripping with contempt. "I am sovereign Xylocha of the Valen Empire. You have leaped into a graveyard. Is this the might of your species? A single rust bucket sent to challenge gods?" Nox leaned casually on the command console, completely unbothered by the terrifying alien staring him down. "Sovereign Xylocha. This is Captain George Knox of the United Nations Space Command. I am here to accept your unconditional surrender. Stand down your weapons, withdraw your fleet from this system, and I won't have to hurt you." For a moment, there was dead silence on the bridge. Even Lieutenant Rhodes looked at Knox as if he had lost his mind. On the screen, the Queen's mandibles parted in a grotesque display of amusement. "You are bold, tiny mammal. Or perhaps your primitive brain is broken. I have 300 dreadnoughts. I have plasma lances that can boil your oceans. You have a ship that looks like it belongs in a museum." "It's a reliable ship," Knox retorted calmly. "Last chance, Xylocha. Run!" The Queen's eyes flashed with anger. "Reduce him to atoms." She cut the transmission. "Incoming fire!" Rhodes shouted, her hands flying across the tactical board. "Multiple plasma lances locking on. Brooks, evasive maneuvers. Take us right down their throats," Knox barked. "Higgins, give me everything you've got to the forward deflectors and start spooling the shear drive." The Manticore lurched violently as a beam of superheated plasma grazed its port side. The ship's outdated shields flared a blinding blue, instantly dropping by 40%. But the Manticore was small, and it was fast. Built for navigating dense asteroid fields and chaotic gravitational anomalies, the frigate dove in a stomach-churning spiral. "Diverting power from life support to thrusters," Higgins yelled over the chaotic blaring of alarms. The human ship darted between two massive Valen dreadnoughts. The alien gunners, used to targeting sluggish, heavy cruisers, struggled to track the tiny, erratic target. A massive volley of plasma fire missed the Manticore, instead striking the shielding of a neighboring Valen ship, causing a localized explosion of green energy. "They're too tightly packed," Rhodes analyzed, her eyes glued to the scanners. "They can't fire their heavy weapons without hitting each other." "Exactly," Knox said, gripping his console as the ship violently shuddered from a near miss. "They set up a tight blockade to intimidate the planet. We're going to use it to our advantage. Brooks, take us to the center of the formation, right into the belly of the beast." "Sir, the thermal load is spiking," Higgins warned. "The hull is heating up. We can't take much more ambient heat from their engines, let alone direct fire." "Just hold her together, David," Knox ordered. On the flagship, Xylocha watched the tiny blip dart through her impenetrable fleet like a mosquito harassing a herd of elephants. "Fools! Stop trying to use the capital cannons! Launch the swarm fighters! Crush that insect!" Thousands of small, dart-like alien fighters began to spew from the hangars of the dreadnoughts. They swarmed like angry hornets, accelerating toward the Manticore. "Fighters inbound, thousands of them," Rhodes reported, her voice remarkably steady, despite the sweat dripping from her chin. "Point defense cannons to auto-fire," Knox said. "Keep our trajectory steady. Higgins, what's the status on the shear drive overload?" "I've bypassed the safeties. The core is going critical, Captain. The spatial anchors are howling. If I drop the containment field now, the resulting gravity wave will be catastrophic. But, sir, we're still inside the blast radius." The ship rocked violently as plasma fire from the fighters began to chew through the armor. Sirens wailed. Sparks showered the bridge as the port console exploded, throwing a junior officer to the deck. "Armor breach on deck 4. "Seal it!" Knox roared over the din. "Brooks, hold your nerve. Not yet. We need to be dead center." The Manticore plowed forward, its twin point defense cannons spitting depleted uranium rounds into the void, shredding alien fighters in brief, silent explosions of fire and debris. But there were too many. The frigate was dying, its hull glowing cherry red, its systems failing one by one. They were now directly in the center of the Valen Armada. 300 dreadnoughts formed a massive sphere of death around them. "We are at the center point, Captain," Brooks yelled. "Higgins," Knox said, his voice piercing through the chaos with absolute, chilling calm. "Drop the core." "Dropping the core, Captain," Chief Engineer David Higgins whispered. His finger came down on the manual override switch, severing the magnetic confinement protocols that kept the ship's experimental heart stable. Deep within the bowels of the UNS Manticore, the General Dynamics fusion reactor screamed as it was forced into a state of intentional, catastrophic failure. The Alcubierre shear drive, a machine designed to slip a vessel through the cosmos by bending space around it, was abruptly starved of its regulatory algorithms. Dr. Albert Graves's classified theorem at M1T wasn't just a theoretical hazard. It was an apocalyptic manipulation of the Einstein field equations. By collapsing the warp bubble while entrenched within a deep gravitational well, the localized metric tensor of space-time was forced into a violent reversion. The physics governing the ensuing event were mind-bending, relying on the sudden catastrophic shift of the Alcubierre metric. ds squared equals minus c squared, dt squared, plus open parenthesis, dx minus v sub sf of r sub sdt, close parenthesis, squared, plus dy squared plus dz squared. When the shape function f of er sub s was instantaneously forced to 0 without a deceleration phase, the stress-energy tensor T mu inverted. The exotic matter stabilizing the bubble didn't just dissipate, it snapped back like a cosmic rubber band. The energy release did not manifest as a fireball. There was no thermal explosion. Instead, it created a pure, unadulterated spatial shear, a tidal wave of gravity. Outside the Manticore, the universe blinked. For a microsecond, absolute silence and stillness gripped the orbital theater above Aegis 7. The thousands of Valen swarm fighters froze. The 300 dreadnoughts, charging their plasma lances for the final, annihilating volley, hung suspended in the void. Then space shattered, a localized compression wave, glowing with a terrifying ethereal violet luminescence of hawking radiation, exploded outward from the tiny human frigate. It moved at a fraction of the speed of light, an invisible shock wave of warped gravity that possessed the kinetic equivalent of a dying star. The first Valen swarm fighters caught in the ripple didn't explode. They were simply erased. The intense gravitational shear stretched them into molecular strings before compressing them into microscopic, dense pellets of raw matter. Aboard the Obsidian Crown, Sovereign Xylocha barely had time to register the anomaly on her tactical spheres. "Spatial rupture expanding," her tactical officer shrieked, the chitin of its carapace rattling in unprecedented terror. "Massive gravitational surge. It is defying all known paradigms." The shockwave hit the inner ring of the Valen dreadnoughts. These were vessels that had survived the crushing atmospheres of gas giants and the glancing blows of antimatter weaponry. Their biometallic armor, a marvel of alien engineering grown in the hyperforges of their homeworld, was considered the strongest material in the known galaxy. It didn't matter. You cannot armor yourself against the fabric of reality folding in on you. The dreadnoughts were caught in the gravitational riptide. The front half of a massive Valen cruiser was violently pulled forward at 3,000 Gs, while the rear half was anchored by a spatial localized vacuum. The ship snapped in two with a silent, catastrophic tearing of metal and flesh. Its exotic power cores breached, detonating in brilliant flashes of sickly green plasma, which were immediately snuffed out as the gravity wave crushed the explosions back in on themselves. Xylotia gripped her command dais as the obsidian crown violently pitched. The sheer arrogance that had defined her reign melted into primal, suffocating panic. "Evasive!" she roared, her telepathic voice shattering the minds of her lesser crew members. "Initiate slip-space anchors. Get us out of this system." "Anchors are hers failing, Sovereign," the helmsman gurgled as the ship's artificial gravity generators violently compensated, throwing the crew against the bulkheads. "The human weapon, it has trapped us. The spatial fabric is too distorted. We cannot jump." Through the primary viewing sphere, Xylotia watched her invincible armada die. The massive, beautiful dreadnoughts were crumpling like aluminum cans crushed by an invisible hand. Ships collided as their navigational thrusters were overwhelmed by the localized gravity storms. The vacuum of space was filled with a swirling vortex of debris, biological fluids, and collapsing plasma fields. She stared into the center of the violet storm, looking for the tiny human ship, expecting to see it vaporized by its own suicidal weapon. But the Manticore was still there. Captain George Knox had not come to Aegis 7 to die. While Graves's theory dictated that the epicenter of the blast would be subjected to infinite kinetic blowback, Higgins had proposed a desperate, untested countermeasure. As the drive went critical, the Manticore had dumped every ounce of auxiliary power from life support, weapons, and sensors into a localized tachyon static field. They had essentially anchored themselves in a null space bubble, an eye of the hurricane, for precisely 4.2 seconds, the exact duration of the shear wave's expansion. Inside the Manticore, it was hell. The inertial dampeners failed. The crew was slammed against their crash webbing, blood vessels bursting in their eyes from the immense pressure differentials. "Hold her together!" Knox bellowed, blood trickling from his nose, his voice barely audible over the horrific groaning of the ship's titanium superstructure. The obsidian crown was in the outer ring of the blockade. The wave hit them last, but its power had barely diminished. Xylotia felt the deck heave beneath her. The biometallic bulkheads groaned, then shrieked, then tore wide open, exposing the bridge to the cold, unforgiving vacuum of space. As the air rushed out of her lungs and the freezing dark claimed her, the Sovereign's final thought was not of her empire, nor of her gods. It was a terrifying realization of her own fatal error. She had mocked a creature holding a match, completely unaware they were standing in a room full of powder. Humanity was not a weed to be uprooted. They were the fire that would burn the garden down. The violet glow of the spatial wave faded, leaving the orbit of Aegis 7 in an eerie, graveyard silence. Where 300 majestic Valen dreadnoughts had once blotted out the stars, there was now only a sprawling, chaotic ring of debris. Shredded armor plating, frozen coolant, and the shattered remnants of an invincible armada formed a new, grim asteroid belt around the colony world. In the dead center of the wreckage, The UNS Manticore drifted. Its hull was scorched black. The once proud Boeing Northrop structural lines warped and buckled. Emergency lighting bathed the bridge in a bloody crimson hue. Sparks rained from the ceiling, and the acrid smell of burnt ozone and melted copper filled the freezing air. Captain Knox unbuckled his harness, his hands shaking slightly. He wiped the blood from his chin and looked around. "Report," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry sandpaper. Lieutenant Commander Rhodes coughed violently, struggling to sit up at her tactical station. She pulled a shattered piece of display glass from her sleeve. "Sensors are mostly blind, Captain, but opticals confirm total enemy fleet destruction. The Valen armada is gone. All of it." "Ship status?" Knox asked, turning toward the engineering console. Higgins was slumped over his board, nursing a broken arm, but his good hand was already tapping frantically on the surviving emergency displays. "It's bad, Captain," Higgins groaned, bringing up a diagnostic table on the main secondary screen. UNS Manticore. Critical damage report. Main fusion core. Scrammed and inert. We are running on secondary lithium-ion batteries. Alcubierre shear drive. Completely fused. The housing is slag. We aren't jumping out anywhere ever again. Life support. Primary scrubbers offline. Atmosphere venting on decks 3 and 5. Bulkheads sealed. We have roughly 12 hours of breathable oxygen remaining. Weapons offline. Comms, short-range telemetry only. Subspace array is destroyed. We're dead in the water, Rhodes summarized quietly. But we're alive. Knox let out a slow, shuddering breath. He walked over to the primary view screen, which was miraculously still functioning, displaying the field of Valen wreckage floating against the backdrop of the battered planet below. "Brooks," Knox said, looking at his helmsman, who was staring wide-eyed at the destruction. "Can you get a signal through to the surface?" Brooks shook his head, clearing the shock. "Routing emergency power to the comms laser now, sir. Hailing the planetary capital." Down on the surface of Aegis 7, Governor Thomas Wright stood in the command bunker, completely paralyzed by the data on his screens. Minutes ago, he had been preparing to issue a final planetary broadcast, advising the citizens to make peace with their gods. He had watched the tiny human ship drop out of warp, fully expecting it to be vaporized. Instead, he had witnessed the most terrifying release of energy in recorded human history. The orbital sensors had gone entirely blind from the gravitational distortion. When they finally rebooted, the alien fleet, the insurmountable apocalyptic threat that had choked them for 19 days, was just gone. "Governor!" the comms officer yelled, his voice cracking with disbelief. "I'm receiving a tight beam laser transmission from orbit. Audio only. It's the UNS vessel, sir." Wright sprinted to the console and slammed his hand onto the receiver. "This is Governor Wright of Aegis 7. Who is this? What just happened up there?" The comms speaker crackled with static, followed by a calm, deeply exhausted voice. "Aegis 7, this is Captain George Knox of the UNS Manticore. The orbital blockade has been neutralized. The skies are clear." Wright let out a breathless laugh, tears welling in his eyes. Cheers erupted throughout the bunker, a deafening wave of relief and triumph from the technicians and military personnel. "Captain Knox, you did it. The whole fleet is gone. I don't know what kind of weapon you brought, but you just saved 3 million lives." "It wasn't a weapon, Governor," Knox replied through the static. "It was an engine, and we're going to need a tow. We are dispatching rescue shuttles immediately, Captain. Hold on. We're coming to get you." The news of the miracle at Aegis 7 took weeks to reach Earth Command, carried by a slow-moving courier drone launched from the colony world. When the data logs from the Manticore were finally decoded at the UNS headquarters in Geneva, the reaction was a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. Admirals who had ordered the abandonment of the sector sat in stunned silence as they watched the telemetry of a single, outdated scout frigate annihilating a fleet that would have decimated Earth's entire defense grid. The Valen Empire, reeling from the sudden, inexplicable loss of their sovereign and their most powerful armada, halted their expansion into human space immediately. The psychological blow was devastating. For centuries, the Valen had dominated through technological superiority. Now they were faced with a terrifying unknown. The humans had not defeated them with superior firepower, plasma shields, or overwhelming numbers. They had defeated them by weaponizing the very fabric of reality. The rumor spread through the galactic intelligence networks like wildfire. The humans were insane. They were willing to tear holes in the universe just to win a battle. At a classified debriefing facility deep within the Rocky Mountains, Captain Knox sat across from a panel of UNS admirals and top brass from DARPA, including Dr. Albert Graves, whose face was pale as he reviewed the flight data. "Captain Knox," Admiral Caldwell began, adjusting his glasses, "what you did was a direct violation of standard tactical protocol. You utilized an experimental drive core in a manner that was explicitly forbidden by Section 4 of the APL guidelines." Knox sat comfortably in his chair, wearing a fresh uniform, his arm in a sling. "With respect, Admiral, Section 4 didn't apply to a scenario where 3 million citizens were sentenced to death by bureaucratic retreat." Caldwell sighed, leaning back. "Be that as it may, the results cannot be argued. You've single-handedly ended the Valen offensive. They've pulled back past the Perseus Arm. Our diplomats are already receiving encrypted ceasefire inquiries." Dr. Graves leaned forward, staring at Knox. "Captain, the tachyon anchoring maneuver Mr. Higgins pulled off. The math suggests a 99.7% chance of catastrophic structural failure. You survived on a microscopic margin of error." "Then I suggest we build stronger ships, Doctor," Knox replied evenly. "Because the rest of the galaxy just learned a very valuable lesson." "And what is that, Captain?" Knox smiled, a cold, hard expression forged in the dark of space. "That humanity doesn't play by their rules. If they back us into a corner, we won't just fight back. We'll break the board." The Manticore was never repaired. It was towed to the orbital shipyards above Earth and left exactly as it was, scarred, melted, and broken. It was converted into a permanent memorial, floating silently in orbit, a testament to the day humanity stopped running. The Valen never returned to Aegis 7. In fact, no hostile alien species would dare blockade a human world for a very long time. Because every time an alien commander looked at their tactical screens and saw a human ship, no matter how small, no matter how archaic, they couldn't help but wonder if it was carrying an engine that could swallow them whole. Humanity wasn't the biggest predator in the dark forest of the galaxy, but they had proven, without a shadow of a doubt, that they were the most dangerous. Thank you for exploring the cosmos with us today. If the UNS Manticore's impossible victory gave you chills, make sure to smash that like button and share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans. Want more epic tales of humanity standing against the odds? Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an adventure. Leave a comment below. What would you name your frigate? Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars.